Thank you. Thank you for coming this morning. And, thank you for the introduction. It's very nice. Uh, I'm excited to be in NarraScope in person. It's really super nice. So, I'm going to talk about the Ace Attorney series. For those of you who don't know me, I see a lot of my friends here and colleagues. So, hi. Thank you for coming. But for those of you who don't know me, I am a associate arts professor at the NYU Game Center. I am a theorist practitioner. So on the one hand, I am a scholar and I teach game studies. I teach narrative design at NYU, but I also work on games. So on my academic side, and then this is the slide of self promotion. I've written a book called Introduction to Game Analysis, which is a very popular textbook in game programs. And part of what I'm going to talk about today is my research. But I also work in games. I started working in game development at MIT as part of my research, and then I moved to commercial games. I've made games for Warner Brothers. I've made games for the Spanish National Ballet, and I'm very happy to be able to talk a bit about, not today, but you can catch me later, about Salt Sea Chronicles by the Beautiful Greek, which was announced on Thursday, and I was part of the writer's room of this game, and I'm really, really proud and can't wait for you to play it. So, that's a promotion. So, what do we actually do? I'm going to put on my academic hat on for my students in the room. You're already familiar with the side of me because I'm really a media scholar. I like comparative media, and that's where is my happy place. I like drawing relationships and comparisons between representations of the same themes and texts across media, not only as adaptation, but as I'm going to show you today, as cultural reframings, like as cultural adaptations. This is a really fun part of my work. And what I've been doing the last years has been studying detective games. That's part of my academic work. Some of it has leaked into my game design and drama practice. But most of these games are adventure games, which is the genre that I wrote my dissertation on. And it also happens that detective games are an ideal case for studying the relationship between games and stories. We have a genre that is playful with the reader. So this has been part of my core. I do other stuff. That's why I'm always so tired. But this has been my core research in the last years. But today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite game series, the Ace Attorney. Who's played the Ace Attorney games? Yes, okay. Yeah, you're my people. So, but this series is not only a popular game series, in this crowd, of course, it would be because you're one of the main audiences, but it's also popular, very very popular in Japan. But one of the reasons why it's interesting, I'm not going to be the fangirl today, just a bit. I'm going to fangirl just a bit. But the Ace Attorney series is a prime example of something that Japanese detective games do best. And yes, it's a detective game. Spoilers. Because it's a hybrid of Western forms and Western texts with Japanese culture and society. So if you're a bit of a Japanophile, my Japanese is crap, but I'll be doing my best to try to show you what the relationships are. So the Ace Attorney series, although many of us tend to say this is Phoenix Wright, but Phoenix Wright is not in all the games even. It's not the protagonist of all of them, but Ace Attorney, the series started 22 years ago. Feel old with me, please. The first game was for the Game Boy Advance. So, hey, this has been around for a long time. Many of you might have played the first version, the first available version outside of Japan for the Nintendo DS. So, again, feel old because that was 2006, something like that. And the title of these games in Japanese is Gyakuten Saiban, which means comeback trial, because that's the conceit of the game. I'm going to provide an overview for those of you who don't know the series, or you might have only played a couple of the titles. So this is a series that spans, I believe it's 11 games. It's 10 games plus a crossover with Professor Layton. And all of them follow an episodic structure. We have in each game, we have a collection of cases that are interrelated. They are telling a story. At times, some of the cases are kind of flashbacks, and we see them, later on. So it's a complete story told in episodes in different cases. And what this is basically on paper, this is court drama, where the player becomes an attorney, a lawyer, who needs to defend someone who's always wrongly accused. In most cases, there's a couple of exceptions. The goal of the game is to turn around the case. Everything is against our client, and we have to flip it, and we have to get our client exonerated. And at the beginning, everything seems lost. All the evidence, all the stories seem to point to our client. So this turnabout that characterizes all the games in the series, we see how the solution goes through several iterations. We are trying to defend our client, and we are getting more evidence, and we're pushing back. And when we think that we are going to get our client exonerated, there's something new that is thwarting us, and it's like, no, you thought that you had it. And it's very convoluted. These stories tend to be very complex. For those of you who've played the games, if you try to retell what happens, I don't think that we all remember. That's not what we remember of the games. We remember the pleasure of turning around, but it's not about what exactly happens. And part of the pleasure of these games is really to disentangle this story and then see where it takes us. They're well written in how they're constructed. We have a couple of games down here. The Ace Attorney Investigations 1 and 2. The second has not been released outside of Japan. The follow a slightly different formula. I don't know if anybody's played them. They're closer to a traditional point-and-click adventure game. They have slightly different mechanics. We're going to focus on the kind of main series today. Although, again, the Ace Attorney games have an expansion of a collecting card game called Teppen. This is the Ace Attorney theme. Phoenix Wright also appears in Marvel vs. Capcom in a couple of the titles. But we're going to talk about the main series. And the main series has been really important because we see how there's been an anime. Some of you might have watched the anime. There is a movie version directed, of all people, by Takashi Miike, director of Audition. That man, he's a great filmmaker. What is he doing with Ace Attorney? I don't know. I've seen the movie. It's kind of goofy. This is the first game, basically. And also, more importantly for me, we have 3 musicals of the Takarazuka Revue. Do you know what the Takarazuka Revue is? Some of you. Is a Japanese musical theater company, all women, and they make musicals out of things like JFK, Ross's Versailles. I think that they're, this week, they're going to stream a James Bond musical. But this is the 3rd musical, and the protagonist is District Attorney Miles Edgeworth, and I want to show you just a bit. Beginning. This is just for the fangirls in the room. Come on. 本日はねじ曲げた思い出も捨てられずに生きてきたAnyways, it's on YouTube. 2 hours and a half. Glorious. So yeah, you should watch it. But yeah, this is how big Ace Attorney is. Part of the longevity and the attractive of these games comes from the characters. As I was saying, it's hard if you ask me to retell any of these cases. I don't know. It's I know snippets, but what do I remember? I remember the characters. They are iconic. We have a cast that repeats from game to game. Characters that we get to know and interact with. Phoenix Wright up on the left, is the kind of connecting tissue of all of them except for the last two because they're kind of like a flashback. But we have a cast where we have the attorney, the prosecutor, we have an assistant that helps us guides us through the case, at times telling us what we have to do, gives us hints about how to conduct our cross examinations in the trial, and we have like a variety of witnesses and culprits and the accused, right? These are characters where there's rivalries, we have friendships, we have characters that get wrongly accused. A bunch of these characters actually swap sides at times. We have attorneys that get accused, we have DAs that end up in the bench. And this is a storytelling formula that is very similar to that of a TV show. Is part of what makes them so easy to kind of get into, because we are in a world that we get familiar with, where we are interacting with all these characters. And really, the whole thing about it being the turnabout, like we are in these characters on a trip. The Ace Attorney games are, in presentation, they're a visual novel that allow players to kind of gather information, talk to people. And what we do here is what I'm going to do is explaining what these turnabout plot mechanics are. Again, those of you who have played the games, this might sound familiar, but I want to kind of break down what these elements are, because then I'm going to connect them to the parts that have inspired me. So when the case starts, we are introduced to the case. We go into a localization, we go into a place. It might be, imagine Tokyo, though in the English translation, they never say where we are. We might be in a village. Some of the cases have taken place in television studios, in a space center, in an aquarium. There's different places. So we get to people, who is there, who are the characters, where do we go, and then murder. Somebody dies. Somebody has to die. As we're going to see, S.S. Van Dyne had a set of rules for detective fiction, and I love his quote of the rules of a whodunit is that there simply must be a corpse in the detective novel, and the deader the corpse, the better. No lesser crime that murder will suffice, right? So it's kind of like somebody dies. This is serious. And at times, what is really shocking, and one thing that Ace Attorney does very well, is that at times the person who dies is somebody that we know, that we might have interacted with at the beginning, or somebody who was our attorney at some point, and they die horribly, and it hurts. This series is not shy in killing people that we care for, which I think is great. Hurting players is something that we should do more of. It's definitely a thing. So at times we see people that we know. So we have Maya, who's one of the assistants. Miles Edgeworth ends up being the accused of things in the first game. We have a client. At times we don't know who they are. We're just kind of dropped into a defense case, and it's like, hi, you're my client. Okay, let's get you exonerated because surely you're innocent, because that's how this game works. And again, in most cases, this is the wrong person. There is a couple of instances when we're actually defending somebody who might be guilty, maybe guilty of the crime that we're dealing with, maybe guilty of some of the crimes, not a good person. But our goal is always to prove their innocence. Then, after we know what's going on, murder, somebody gets wrongly accused. So our role is really to gather information in preparation for the trial. We do a second round of talking to people, examining places, gathering objects. We are trying to know what has happened by exploring the space. And then when we're ready, we go into the trial. And the goal of the trial is to set the record straight. We have witnesses who are making their depositions, so we have a cross-examination. And as they're speaking, and because this follows the visual novel format, we see paragraph by paragraph, and what we can do is pressing them on specific statements, asking them to elaborate and see if they provide us with more information. But the goal here is to find contradictions, find inconsistencies. At times might be by pressing the witness. At times there might be a piece of evidence that we can produce and we can show and say like this piece of evidence contradicts what the witness just said. So the idea is that we're trying to correct, find the truth by correcting these depositions. There's also special mechanics in this space that allows us to reveal even more information. So, for example, we have the Magatama magic stone. There are supernatural elements in this game. There's ghosts and people getting possessed and helping us in the trial sphere. But it's great. We have, for example, one of my favorites is actually in Apollo Justice. We have a bracelet that allows us to detect when people make a gesture that betrays that they are lying. But at times, and this is very interesting, when we travel around the world, we also have examples in some of the games where we have countries with different legal systems. In the last two games, in the Ace Attorney Chronicles, they take place in the 19th century, and we travel to fantasy England, and they have a jury, and we have to pit the jury members against each other. So what we do is like we have additional mechanics, not only in the pressing, but ways to actually get to the truth and kind of correcting what the story is, as we're going to see. So here, like what is interesting, like this is kind of like the core of Ace Attorney. This is the iconic, hold it, objection, like the way that Phoenix Wright, for example, like stops the witness and kind of like tries to get them to tell the right story. We have, what is interesting here is that the defense attorney is the one who is looking for the truth, not the prosecutor. The prosecutor's goal is to get our client convicted, and ours is to get them exonerated. That's the turnabout. So what is interesting here is that what we do by setting this record straight, one of the things that happens is that at times the cycle of like getting to the end of one day, continuing back to the investigation, and then restarting the case, like that can take like several days. I think that in this world, the trials take like 3 days. So this can kind of like repeat. But in the end, the kind of climax of our case is that the culprits reveal themselves. And, there's the, let me see. This is what plays when you're going to get them. Yeah. Anyways, I love this view. It's called corner. And this is when we know that we're in a Capcom game. This is like a fighting game. It's like, yeah, we're going to get them. And these are like several of the culprits that was like they just melt down at the stand, right? So like that's the climax. We know that we did it. They reveal themselves in front of everybody, in front of the judge. It's glorious. It's great. The other thing, very briefly, that I want to talk about is that in their localization, as I was saying before, the Ace Attorney games kind of tried to conceal that they were Japanese and failed horribly. And as the games continue, like we were seeing that we have a TV show that's called Steel Samurai. There's maid cafes. The small towns look very Japanese. Things are written Japanese. What the hell is this, right? So it's been interesting how in the last two games that were released, the ones in the 19th century, they do acknowledge it's like, yeah, we're Japanese. It's okay. Like they kind of lean on it, and it's central to the identity of the games. But one of the things, I've already said this, but I want to call attention to the fact that I've been talking about Ace Attorney as detective games because they are. They're not really about lawyering. You don't need to know any law to play these games. You never learn any law. Like the law is like structuring how it happens. And at times, I believe it's in the second game, you drop into a trial, you have amnesia, and you're kind of like, okay, I'm just going to defend the client, and it's like you're just kind of making it up as you go because you don't need to know the legal system really. Like this is the structure, but not the law. And this part of how they're detective stories, part of it is because of how they're structured. So now it's like, okay, academic comes in. One academic, hopefully. Because, detective stories, one of the reasons why I studied them, as I was saying before, is that they are playful by nature. Like as a genre, is something that is teasing the reader to figure out what has happened. Bernard Suits has an article where he's arguing that it's a game between the writer and the reader. And the reader is trying to figure out what has happened as they're reading the story. So they're trying to solve the case before they get to the end of the story. So what detective stories do, that as we're going to see in a minute, informs why Ice Attorney games are detective games, is that detective stories specifically have two levels of story. On the one hand, I'm borrowing this from Zvetan Todorov, who wrote a taxonomy of detective stories. In a detective story, we have two stories. On the one hand, we have the story of the crime, things that have happened before the story starts. We don't know what might have been. That is the mystery. On the other hand, we have the story of the investigation. We have the story of the detective that is trying to reconstruct that first story. So we have a kind of two-level structure that is what the core of a detective story is. Incidentally, this also applies to a lot of game narrative, whether they're detective stories or not. Todorov, from this, tells us that depending on which story is dominant, we have two different genres. The genres of detective stories are way more extensive than this, but he's making the distinction between the whodunit, which is the kind of story where what it's about is solving the story of the crime. That's the core of it, like trying to reconstruct that, trying to retell it. So the focus is on the crime, and we are driven by curiosity. We want to know what might have happened before. Versus the thriller, where the story of the crime is a trigger, is what sets up the action, but we're focusing on the detective. So while in the first case we have very typically things like Agatha Christie or Sherlock Holmes stories, in the second case we have people like Raymond Chandler, the kind of noir, private eye kind of stories fall into the thriller. For today, we're going to focus on the whodunit, who also other authors call the clue puzzle genre, because what the Ace Attorney games are a type of whodunit, a very specific type of whodunit. So as I was saying before, the Ace Attorney games are not really about being a lawyer, but being a good detective. Because what we have to do is reconstructing the story of the crime. What we do in the cross-questioning is trying to retell that story of the crime correctly. We're looking for the evidence. We're looking for like the right, version of the story, so that we can actually exonerate our client. So that's the core of Ace Attorney. Is at core they're a whodunit, but they're also a whodunit because they were conceived as one. This chap here, Takumi, is the creative director, is the director of the Ace Attorney games. And when he entered the games industry, he wanted to make mystery games. And very handily, what follows now is just things that I've read in interviews that he's listed as his inspirations. This is not conjecture. This is what he said that has inspired him. So let's see how specifically his inspirations have become embodied in these games. So, when Ace Attorney started as a pet project, he worked on Dino Crisis, and they were kind of reassigning people to different projects, and he chose this very small game. He wanted to make a mystery game. So in his core concept for it was having a game where the player would be rewarded for their deductions. So the idea of exposing the lies of the culprit was the core of it. That was his core mechanic. That is the turnabout. And he thought of the defense attorney as a way to showing that. But what we're facing here are really detective games. So let's go bit by bit on what this media origins, what the origins of Ace Attorney is, what the title of the talk is about. So in this interview, Takumi gives us a breakdown of the things that he read that he was using as his source. So to begin with, he mentions John Dixon Card's The Judas Window, which is a locked room murder story. Locked room murder stories are mysteries. Are those where there's a dead person and there's a locked room, nobody came in and out. We don't know how this could have happened. It's very, very typical. It's a very typical whodunit trope. But in this particular novel, at the beginning, the murder happens, and then the second half takes place in a courtroom. It's a trial, much like the Ace Attorney series turns into one. So that's one source of inspiration that I'm going to explain about. But the others I'm going to break down a bit more. Because he also mentions Stanley Gardner's Perry Mason series, The Bucks. He also mentions the honkaku mysteries, which I'll explain what it is in a second, and also the TV show Columba. So let's go through these and how they connect with the Ace Attorney games. So the honkaku mysteries, the honkaku whodunit, the Japanese whodunit, has a very interesting origin. In the beginning, honkaku is a 20th century genre, but before the arrival of detective stories in Japan, because detective stories were a Western form, we have authors in France, in the UK, in the US who were writing detective stories, but in Japan, it was not a narrative form. It was something that was important. Before the arrival of these stories to Japan, the closest to a detective story would be courtroom narratives, funnily enough. So in the 17th and 18th century, these stories had, wise judges, that, how they brought justice to a culprit, how they were basically infallible. So we have those courtroom narratives alongside the stories of like criminals and how horrible they were. Like that was kind of like the gap of the detective and like the mystery story. But what is interesting here is that these stories were told in chronological order, one thing after another. As we've seen, the detective story is really based on these two levels of the story of the crime is not known, it's out of order. We are trying to reconstruct it as we read. So this was already challenging the literary conventions of Japanese novels and Japanese storytelling. So that was the first disruption that that detective stories brought to kind of Japanese cultural production. And this chap was one of the Kuriwa Riko was the first translator of stories into Japanese. He was was one of the people who started bringing this foreign new form into Japanese. One thing that is very interesting of this early detective fiction, and as you can read here, is the way that they were translated. So Ruiko, whose photo we just saw, he did not quite translate the works word for word. Rather, he read them and then he retold them in Japanese, kind of like from memory. But he actually admitted that this was not quite a translation, because the thing that he was doing was, kind of starting to bring in Japanese elements to the storytelling. So, for example, there would be a story that takes place in Paris, but they would pay with yen, and the names of people would be in Japanese. Now, in games, for example, we call this localization. It's a way to make people understand the content of our game, for example, and it's a way of making it more accessible. But in order to do that, they were creating, this kind of virtual spaces. This is virtual Paris. In that is kind of a mix of both cultures, which is fascinating because this is basically what we see in Ace Attorney 2. This kind of mingling of cultures is kind of at the core of detective stories in Japan already. So Ace Attorney is part of that legacy. There's also the stories of Taro Hirai, whose pen name was Edogawa Rampo. If you know Japanese, Edogawa Rampo is Edgar Allan Poe, said in Japanese. But he's considered the grandfather of Japanese detective fiction. And kind of like Takumi has said that he didn't quite like the stories of Rampo because they get kind of like truculent and over complex. But he was the one who kind of opened the door for the mysteries, the Japanese mysteries that I'm going to talk about in a second. But one last thing before I tell you a bit more about the honkaku mysteries is that these early detective games in Japan at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, they were a window into the judicial systems of other countries. This is also at a time where the infallibility of judges was starting to get questioned. We have stories of private detectives that have come to kind of like make up for the shortcomings of the police force because they might be corrupt or because they might be useless, right? So this idea of like questioning law, questioning the system, is already part of what detective stories do. And again, if you've played the Ace Attorney games, that is something that we see constantly too. So that's part of the heritage, the kind of conceptual heritage of Ace Attorney comes from this background. They're also bringing the scientific method and rationality as a way to tackle crime, rather than wisdom, the wisdom of the judge. This is about finding evidence, having proof and scientific proof, and using logic and reason to find the culprit rather than the wisdom or the intuition of a judge. And all this background is interesting because I've been saying this, the last two released titles of Ace Attorney are the Ace Attorney Chronicles, and they take place precisely at that time, the end of the 19th century. So we have specifically this character called Sherlock Holmes. After they didn't make this up, this is a direct reference to one of the Arsène Lupin novels, by Maurice Leblanc, whom Takumi has acknowledged as being one of his inspirations too. So we have Sherlock Holmes. It's hard to say. Is the character that we are interacting with. Holmes has an interpretation of the story of the crime, and then what we have to do is correct Holmes because he has a lot of, panache, and he does have a lot of charisma, but he gets it wrong. We are the Japanese trainee attorney, telling Holmes how to get it right. But also the conceit of these games is that we are controlling Japanese characters who go to fantasy England to learn about their judicial system. So the context of this, these games take place precisely at that moment of the kind of like meet between Western culture and Japanese culture, and those tensions and how they're in dialogue with each other. And the fact that these are the latest games that have been released is very telling of like how they understand the nature of the games. It's really cool. So the honkaku mysteries. So this is where they are. The honkaku mysteries are a detective genre that appeared at the end of World War II, or after World War II in Japan. And they were inspired partly by the rules of S.S. Van Dyne, which I mentioned before. This is a genre that is kind of based and acknowledges a lot of the influence of the whodunits of the golden age of detective fiction. People talking about John Dixon Carl, whom we've mentioned, Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sawyer's, like all these, like what we understand as the classic whodunit. This is like the 1920s, 1930s. And the honkaku mysteries use tropes, and at times they tell you like this is like this trope in John Dixon Carr's novel, and they talk about it in the novel itself, like directly. But the goal of the honkaku is that this is about fair play. The reader has all the clues necessary to solve the mystery before they get to the end, to reconstruct the story of the crime. What is interesting is that because this is the tension of puzzle design. If you are game designers, specifically puzzle designers, if you make the solution too evident, it's not fun. If you make it too obscure and you get to the end, it's also frustrating. So how do you find that balance? What the honkaku mysteries do is what we see in Ace Attorney. We think that we have the solution. There's a new piece of evidence that throws that to the ground, and we have to start over. I've been reading some of these novels, and they're very convoluted. They're just convoluted, like the Ace Attorney games. They are, helping us to figure out the case, and at the same time, they're changing it constantly. And in these rules, if you want to read them at some point, these rules are basically about what not to do. Don't be predictable. Don't make the butler the murder the criminal. He's not the culprit, because that's being done. That's boring. These are all about how to keep the detective story surprising, like the whodunit. The moment that we've seen something already done, we know what's going to happen, and what we want to do is talking as a writer for a second. We want to keep our audience, we want to keep our players surprised, intrigued, driven by curiosity. So the Van Dyne's rules are supposedly one of the inspirations for the honkaku, the proper mystery. The honkaku of World War II is kind of like the origins of that. There was also in the 80s the Shin honkaku, the new honkaku mysteries. So we have like two references, and both are also in the inspiration for Shu Takumi. And another thing that is interesting about these mysteries is that they are very game-like. Shimada Soji, who is the author of the Tokyo Zodiac Killings, one of the new honkaku games, said that honkaku stories said the honkaku mysteries are detective stories that are, and I quote, not only literature, but also to a greater or lesser extent, a game. It seems handy when you find this as a researcher. Like, yes, got it. So to this end, what is interesting is that the honkaku novels, at least the ones I've been reading so far, they always include diagrams, floor plans, maps that tell us what the space looks like. We get a sense of where things are, especially for things like a locked room mystery, like is the case of the Honjin murders. Where things are, how could this have happened, right? And this is usually like either part of the story, or like at the beginning. We also have a list of the characters that we're going to meet. We're not always told who's going to die, but we have the information. That's part of the fairness of the honkaku mystery. And again, we have crimes that are dizzyingly complex. And at times, literally in one of these novels, there's a Rube Goldberg-like way of committing the crime that, oh my God, I still kind of visualize it after having read the story. But also, like, these are stories, again, the connection with the West. They pay homage to their heroes. In the Decagon House Murders, the characters that we're following, this is an homage to And Then There Were None. Then going to an island, and people start to die. And everybody on the island takes up the names of famous detective story authors like Agatha, and we have Poe, we have Carr, LaRue for Gaston Leroux. So we have, they are saying, yes, this is Western. We are making that connection. So this is the genre that is very particular to Japan. First, because of this convolution, because this idea of fairness of being a game-like mystery, but also because it acknowledges the Western influence and how it's adapting it into Japanese culture. So as an artifact, they're really fascinating. So that's one. Now you know what the honkaku mystery is. Hopefully, this is the introduction. The next thing is Columbo. Who's seen the Columbo TV show? A few of you. Oh wow. Okay. It's kind of like back in fashion because I think Poker Face. Have you seen Poker Face? If you haven't, Poker Face is great. But yeah, the Columbo story, the structure of Columbo is a bit different. It's not quite a whodunit, but some people call it a how catch 'em, because we know who the culprit is from the beginning. We see the crime being committed. We see how the criminal is trying to cover their tracks. So it's what we call an inverted story format. We know where we want to go and where to get. So what we do, and then what we have in Ace Attorney, that reminds us of how Columbo works, is that actually, I believe the very first case of Ace Attorney is like Columbo. We see the criminal. And when we see our criminal get to the stand, it's like, okay, how can we take them down? So what Columbo does in the TV show, at times, he might not know who the criminal is, but he gets a pretty good idea, and he starts like following and kind of harassing the criminal and like keeping asking them, comes back and says like one more thing. And he's always trying to find that piece of evidence that will prove their contradiction, that will prove their downfall, just like in Ace Attorney. He has to catch them with evidence. This is again what we do in Ace Attorney. So a lot of what Ace Attorney does is using this structure. At times we have an idea of who the criminal might be, so we are trying to catch that contradiction, like bring it up. So the idea of, as Takumi says, the real fun behind the mystery stories lies in the logic, when you connect all the hints and solve the mystery. Inverted stories, on their turn, have the chance to shine because they're the outliers. Like the idea is that you can connect the dots, but you already know where you are going to get. So that's one part of the structure, one part of the drive of the Ace Attorney games. The last and most evident influence on Ace Attorney are the Perry Mason books. Although the TV show is also one of the influences. Has anybody seen Perry Mason? This is way older. Well, like a few people, yeah. The books were from like, I believe the 50s, like 40s and 50s. John, no, it's not John T. Carr. It's oh my God, what's his name? Earl Stanley. Earl Stanley Garner. I'm mixing up the two people with three names. Earl Stanley Garner was a lawyer, and he wrote these novels. He was like churning out, I think there's like 200 novels of Perry Mason. After Agatha Christie, they're some of the best-selling series in the world. So he was just churning them out. But these were the inspiration. At first, it's adaptation, and then Perry Mason kind of ran with the formula, because it does have a formula. And it was a long-running TV show in the 50s and 60s in American television. But then there were also like TV shows later on. Columbo, in the previous example, was mostly in the 70s and 80s. But the last TV movies of Columbo are like 2002. Perry Mason is another equally, like long-running show based on a long-running series of novels. And what we can see here is that, the influence of Perry Mason, the TV show, we can see it in the layout of the courtroom, for example, and how the cross-questioning is set up. This also, when I realized this, I was kind of like, pulling my hair. I was like, oh my God, I should have seen this. In Apollo Justice, the fourth game of the series, we have a virtual crime scene reconstruction. It's like a game, and you can tell the computer what to recreate, and you see it virtually, and it's called the Mason system. So it's very, very much, in your face kind of references. And part of the charm of Perry Mason, one of the things that we get from Perry Mason is that it is also very, very formulaic. We have a set of characters that repeat from story to story in the novels and also in the TV show. Perry Mason is the attorney. Dallas Street is his secretary. Paul Drake is a PI, is a detective that goes around and gathers evidence for Perry Mason. We have the lieutenant. We have who is Lieutenant Track, is the one who usually arrests the suspect. And we have our district attorney, the DA, that is always trying to get our client convicted. If you play the games, this is precisely the same structure as the Ace Attorney. We have Dallas Street and Paul Drake are rolled into one as our assistant in the game, but otherwise we have a very similar character structure. We know what to expect. This kind of formula is very handy when you are a game maker. But also, as the audience, we know what our expectations are. In Perry Mason, we also have, for example, you know, at times any of these characters can get into the bench. You know, they can become the criminals too. The, part of the charm of setting up expectations is that you can also tear them down. So as I was saying, Earl Stanley Garner, he wrote a lot of books, and this author Russell Nye talks about it as being having a very specific formula. He's not talking about Japanese culture, but he does compare this to Japanese Noh theater, which is like very conventional, very formulaic. You know, like the way that the stories are told is there's specific characters who move in a specific way and have specific actions. It's the same with Perry Mason. It has a very predictable structure. We start with the audience that is introduced to a potential victim to a new space, who surrounds them, including someone who has very clear motivations to kill that person. Then murder. And all the points, all the evidence is kind of indicating that the most obvious subject, the most obvious suspect, becomes automatically the client of Perry Mason, who loves lost causes, but he never loses. Well, he loses a couple of times in the show. Then the second half of the show is the courtroom scene, where things usually look really bad for the client. And the district attorney presents evidence that first allows the judge to send the case to trial, to go ahead. With the help of his assistants, Paul Drake and Della Street, Mason gathers the evidence that demonstrates, for example, the unethical and uneven criminal behaviors on the other characters. And one of these pieces of evidence is ultimately what makes the culprit break, usually at the stand. So this is the structure. If you pay attention, this is the same structure that I use to describe Ace Attorney. It's just lifted from Perry Mason, step by step. It allowed, Earl Stanley Garner to, write 200 novels. But, this structure combined with the turnabout trope is what makes Ace Attorney tick. The story, goes through multiple retellings, just as we saw in the honkaku novels. It's a mix of this with the honkaku kind of like trying to figure out what the story is, retelling it, finding a new piece of evidence. It all falls apart. We have to retell it again. So that they're continuously defying the player to figure out, how things have happened. And the fun is to piece together the pieces of the case as if it were a puzzle. So these are the twists and turns, the core to the drama, but they are a combination of this with the honkaku structure. And also, as we've seen, the Ace Attorney games are a episodic series. We also see how every episode follows this formula. This is also predictable. So yeah, now you all go to watch a bit of Perry Mason. There's like different places you can watch Perry Mason on streaming for free. And so here's the conclusion. Like all of this, I hope that this was fun. I had a lot of fun actually putting this together. But the things that I want you to take from this, is that Ace Attorney, when we think about Ace Attorney, it's a detective game. It's not about being a lawyer. It's about setting the record straight. It's about reconstructing the story of the crime. And part of its appeal and its endurance, part of it comes from this cross-cultural mix of Western and Japanese references and how they kind of blend together. And that's part of the charm of it, and also the fact that they've been like openly acknowledged and openly stated and made my research so much easier. So I'm not hypothesizing what the influence is. The game director just told me, so I was like, yes, great. But part of it, the key to a good whodunit is that on the one hand we do have tropes, we do have a structure that is recognizable, right? We have the things like the murder mystery in a dinner. It's like you have different people go to a house, somebody's going to die, right? That sets up the expectations, but part of what we do in whodunits and in games like Ace Attorneys turn it down? How do we make it surprising? What the pleasure of these games is really connecting those dots and being able to tell the story of the crime or understanding the story of the crime as we reconstruct that crime story. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening. Hope it was fun. Any questions, comments? Yes. Mhm. Okay, so the question for people who might be watching on streaming on the recording is that, what is the responsibility of games to reproduce, you know, faithfully or realistically systems, or judicial systems or systems that might affect them, directly. It's interesting because yeah, the fantasy judicial system of Ace Attorney is very distinctive. It's very much trying not to comment, I guess, on um, Japanese justice, where there is death penalty, if I remember correctly, or any other world. And in a way, like, it's one of the tricky things of working in games right now. One of the things that I like about this series is that it acknowledges finally that it's Japanese, and it's really hard to have those kind of national markers. But this kind of fantasy system that only exists in the game, um, it's also a way to make it more palatable to a global audience. You're not trying to comment specifically on a law system or a way to see in the world. That said, it's interesting because all games have politics, and in this game, these games do portray systems of oppression. Um, they don't quite critique them, although in the last game, I think it's the first case of the Ace Attorney Chronicles, the second part. Uh, One of the things that happens is that in the old Japanese system, women could not be attorneys. So we have cross dressing, and we have a woman presenting as a man and pretending that she's a man because otherwise she will not be allowed to defend her friend. So it's there, that there are things that it does. It doesn't tackle them head on, but I think that one of the things that I learned from learning about the early detective stories is that just the fact that these stories exist and show alternatives, and I think that that's the responsibility of games. It's like, well, if we have a world that is not fair, where we have systems of oppression, at times we can, just showing that things could be some other way is already opening up people's minds, that we cannot take for granted that this is how the world works. So it's true that they don't tackle it head on, but again, like what Ace Attorney does in a way is kind of seems to parallel these early detective stories in Japan, which were controversial. I mean, there were critics who were saying this is not literature, this doesn't tell stories properly in chronological order. That was one of the pushbacks that they gave to detective stories. It's like, this is not proper storytelling. You tell things with beginning, middle, and end. What's this crap of like saying things out of order? So just that, like showing the possibilities, is what can be, like it's one of the things that we can do through games. But yeah, it's not. I blame more the kind of global market and like trying to, and this whole idea of like trying to disguise that Ace Attorney was a Japanese story, so that it's not more direct on that. But you see snippets there. Yeah, thank you for the question. Wow. Okay, back then with the beret and then. Mhm. So what's the question? Like if there's other. Uh, Hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's like I have a whole of a talk, and I actually have an article. So the question is, are there other examples of how a genre of detective stories have influenced other media or games, for example? So yes, one of my in my previous work, I wrote about postmodern detective games because we have a clear examples of postmodern detectives in literature and film. So, for example, I talk a lot about Twin Peaks. I love Twin Peaks, and how Twin Peaks and that format has influenced games like Deadly Premonition. So that's like that kind of like crossover. The influence, for example, of like David Lynch on video games and David Lynch specifically Twin Peaks on games is really there. I'll be happy to send you the link to the article. But yes, it's like that's where I have fun. This is another thing that I found. But thank you for the question. Yes, we had a question here. Hmm. Yes. Hmm. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, so the question is, that I've come like what the influence of the tenketsu, I can't pronounce anything today, sorry. Structure, the Japanese structure of, that is basically start, rising tension, twist, and that's third and then down, which is how a lot of people kind of explain, the rising dramatic curve. It's more complicated than that in Japanese stories. But yeah, like I think that this also there, like it's very conventional, but in a way, like when you look at the stories of Ace Attorney, you can see it in the kind of um, investigation trial down and how at times they kind of recur, if that recurs. So it's not that there is one, but there's like the little chapters. It's like that structure you can see kind of repeated in chunks. So I can see that, but I think that it's also like it's a more general um, narrative structure. Whereas here, like this is, there are genres that have very, very specific formulas. Romance novels, for example, I know that publishers like Harlequin, for example, has their formulas like locked away in a drawer, and they give them to people like this is by page whatever this has to happen. They have like different specific structures, and I think that that's what they're doing with Ace Attorney. It's like it's very, very, very specific, but it's compatible with all the more general structures. Yes, thank you for the question. It's back there in the pink, very pink. Love your pink. Okay, you're going to use the microphone. Is it?
Hello. Okay.
Hmm.
So I came in like 20 minutes into the talk, so I'm sorry if you talked about this, but I'm just wondering about like the localization of Ace Attorney into other languages. Like, I think it's English trans. I'm interested in localization. Like, the original name of Phoenix Wright is I can't pronounce it, but something like
Naruhodo.
yeah,
Like
dragon, and then
exactly.
like I got it,
Yeah.
kind of understanding. And so they translate it to like Phoenix and I'm right.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on like the localization with all this multicultural stuff between like that and like there's also this kind of commentary that people have made on like turning it into like California or whatever in the English translation.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel silly because I know that there's a couple of people I know that I believe worked in the organization. I should have checked with them before this presentation. If I remember correctly, the only translation that I've ever seen was into Spanish, and I think they kept the English names. It's interesting because if we had seen a bit more of the Takanazuka review version, they don't call Phoenix Wright in Japanese is Yuchi Naruhodo. Naruhodo is like we got it. But in the musical, they call him Phoenix Raito. They use the English name in Japanese. Like my Japanese is crap, but I understood that. I was just like, what? So it's interesting because the names, yeah, the names of all the characters. I forgot to mention this, but the names and all the characters in Japanese and in the English translation are puns. They use puns a lot. Edgeworth, that's the DA. He's great. He's my favorite character probably. But yeah, like it's interesting how a bit of that has been lost in other localizations. And like I would have to look it up, but I'm pretty sure I bought my mom Ace Attorney in Spanish because I know that she would like it, and I remember the title on the box is Phoenix Wright. So the English has taken over even in Japan, which is weird. Yes, we had more hands. Okay, back then and then back here, and then we finish. Yes, run, run.
All right. So you showed some of the culprit breakdowns,
Mhm.
and it's really noticeable how theatrical and dramatic those breakdowns are. And I'm wondering, you touched on the influence of no theatre in a structural sense, but I'm curious about whether we're seeing any other kinds of theatrical influences from Japanese culture and theatre traditions like kabuki in some of these stylistic touches and approaches.
There is actually a character that comes from kabuki theater, and if I remember correctly, there's like a kabuki company at some point, and like there's somebody who has like that kind of exaggerated makeup, and there are some performers where the kind of the way that they dress like and the way that they move reminds us of kabuki, which is I think the theater form that is best known outside of Japan. No is with masks, is very formulaic. Like each mask is a stock character. That's basically what Nai was talking about. But here, like I think that you can see it in like the gestures. Like for example, when the attorney wants to stop the witness, the objection and like the very recognizable pointing finger that has become so iconic. I went to Japan and there were ads for attorneys and they had the pointing finger and I'm like, is this oh, no, it's not Phoenix Wright. This like, it's become it's kind of reverted back into the culture, so you can see it in like representations, but like in the same way that the maid cafe on like you can see that, and that's why at times it feels kind of silly when they're trying to pretend that it's not Japan, because it very obviously is. There's another case that takes place in a noodle house, in a soba house, and actually knowing the different types of noodles is important in the case. So how you localize that, you cannot really hide that. But yeah, like I think that in the limited these animations, for example, I believe they come originally from the GBA versions. So they didn't have a lot of room, so that's why they become like so dramatic. Like they don't, they kind of move the camera in this early version, so the movement of the characters is what is telling us like how much tension there is. So yeah, thank you for the question. Okay, are we out of time? Okay. Okay, so we have one here and then the one on Discord, and there we go because we're over time. And then afterwards, like if anybody wants to continue talking, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, awesome talk, by the way.
Thank you.
I've been playing these games as like a little child, which is redundant. But
Thank you for making me feel old.
but like it's interesting to me, like having like started playing these like 15, 20 years ago, and like even like into now. I'm also for a game that has such Western like influence, like I think that like there's an argument to be made that it like either has or hasn't made like the jump in other ways that like other media has, like across into like the States, where like in such like a culture of like mystery now and like whodunits and true crime, like you'd think that it would like be picking up steam, but they're not even releasing the games in the US.
Yes.
Do you think that there is like a barrier there, and like why that exists?
It's an interesting question. Like, why aren't those? We are in the age of mystery, and I think that I keep saying that we're in the age of the whodunit, because whodunits are kind of cozy. We need whodunits. The world around us doesn't make any sense. It's been like everything has been so hard, and like in the period of 1920s, 1930s, it was the golden age of the whodunit. We are in a similar kind of in between, a lot of conflict. So we tend to go into the things that we recognize that are kind of like comfortable, and like the we can figure things out. So things like true crime, for example, or the kind of a more documentary kind of thing, like it's something that has had its moment, but I think that part of it might be this idea of the formula, the recognizable. Like when if you work in the games industry and you have to pitch a game, it has to be something that you can get in like a minute. Whodunits and the formula of the whodunits is something that is recognizable. Whereas like how to make a true crime game, I think the true part is what can make it difficult because you might be kind of rehashing or retelling stories of real people, and you have to license those. And like maybe they don't want to have something like a game that might be thought of as something frivolous, for example. So I don't think I have like a specific answer for that, other than, due time. I think that what I like about Ace Attorney is that it acknowledges its roots in literature and TV very openly, and I think that in games in general, we should be looking more at the world and making games that are situated in the world rather than just making games about games. But yeah, it's a kind of like large question. We can talk about it over lunch if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Let's go to the Discord question, and then we go get lunch. Thank you for staying.
Don't forget. So Dan Aran on Discord asks, could you elaborate on the parallel between Perry Mason's structure and Japanese no theater?
So the no theater, again, this is like a throwaway line in the book that I got this from. So yeah, Russell Knight just says this is like Japanese no theater, and he goes like, you know what no theater is. Luckily, in my previous life, I did study a bit of no theater. So no theater is the kind of most serious, aristocratic way of theater. Kabuki has like the big makeup, big movements, and whatnot. This is like serious, slow, telling that there is a set of stories. Oops, sorry. There is a set of stories that is being told, and as I said, the key to know is that there's stock characters. Each stock character has a mask, and you can see like different types of women have like different masks, and they're kind of like like different gods, types of women, types of warriors, types of old wise men. And each character also has a set of movements and how they move, which if you work in adventure games and have to work in sprite sheets for your animations, basically no theater is all about creating those sprite sheets, but in theatrical movements. So I think that's what he refers to as being very formulaic. Having characters that are recognizable, that are like one thing that you do if you're a theater actor is learning the specific movements and the ways and the outfits that they wear, because they are part of a tradition, a very kind of strict tradition of how to tell those stories that are kind of old, and there's like the proper way of doing it. I think I forgot to say that honkaku means the proper mystery. It's like the proper way of doing mystery. So no, it's also about the proper way of telling these old aristocratic stories. But again, like this is a throwaway line in the book, but I happily know a bit about nothing. Thank you for the question online. Thank you everybody for staying a bit longer, and if you want to talk about more about this, I'll be around on lunch. Thank you.